many years ago. I think I would say more than 8 years ago. Dan would probably say more than 12 years ago or something. I showed up at a company to do some asterisk training. And one of the people there was Dan. And Dan had written a very, very nice shim between Asterisks AMI and the contact center software in the company in which he worked, and he'd written it in Node.js. And this was back in the early days before everybody was doing Node.js. Dan was early there. And so I said to Dan, you ought to come to Astricon and talk about this. And so Dan came to Astricon, and he's been talking at conferences and even running conferences ever since. So let's give a big ClueCon welcome to Dan Jenkins, and let's get his slides up on the screen, please. Thank you.
Thank you,
Over
David.
to you, Dan.
Thank you. Today's session is about building a new business on open source software. And it seems rather apt to be doing that at ClueCon. So a little bit about me before, there we go. A little bit about me before we get going. So my Twitter handle is Dan_Jenkins. You can at me and tell me how terrible my talk is or how good my talk is. I don't mind. I'm the founder of a consultancy, a real-time communication consultancy called Nimble Limited. I organize a conference, like David said, that's based in the UK called ClueCon. And then I'm the founder of a new company called Broadcaster.VC Limited. So very, very quickly, I know that we're at ClueCon, and I'm very jealous of all of your T-shirts. They're very cool. ClueCon Virtual is back this year. So last year we did it in June, I think. And this year I was kind of hoping not to have to do one. I was hoping to kind of plan to do an in-person one very early on next year. But the way things are going, it doesn't look like that's maybe going to happen, because actually organizing a conference, like, hats off to the ClueCon team in these challenging times, to say the least, is very, very difficult. So we've decided to do a virtual ClueCon again. And the CFP is currently open, and it closes on Sunday. So you've got Sunday to do it as well, but it closes on Sunday. And then we're going to do records halfway through November. And then the week of the 6th to the 10th of December, we'll have ClueCon Virtual. And we're hoping for 30 to 40 sessions spread over the course of the week. And then the website will be going live later on this week, as we've got sponsor news and speaker news as well. But that's not why you're listening to me. So let's talk about building a new business on OSS. More specifically, Broadcaster.VC. Because Nimble Limited, my consultancy business, is built on open source software, because that's what we consult on. But we implement open source software through Nimble Ape. But at the end of the day, it's not my business that actually goes and runs a product or whatever. Whereas Broadcaster does. So that's a very nice Broadcaster logo there. So let's first rewind. What's Broadcaster? Broadcaster, in short, allows talent, air quote talent, to connect to production workflow, video production workflows remotely. So joining a news program or joining a conference remotely, that kind of stuff. AV teams want to ingest media in a very specific way. And WebRTC never gave us the opportunity to really do that very nicely. So it was born during ClueCon Virtual 2020 last year. And last year we recorded sessions through vMix, and vMix uses WebRTC, but it was very limiting. Like, you couldn't do a camera and a screen share. You couldn't do a screen share at all. So all of these things were actually very limiting. And so we ended up using a mix of Jitsi and screen recording and vMix, and it just wasn't very good at all. And I was sat there as a WebRTC enthusiast, as someone that consults on WebRTC, and I was like, there's a better way to do this. And so the AV team that we work with was talking about something called NDI, and I was like, what the hell is NDI? And it's basically a protocol to send uncompressed media into professional workflows. There's also NDI HX and HX2, and that uses some compression, etc. But the raw NDI stuff is uncompressed media, and it's used extensively. So we made a demo, and then we thought, I've been thinking about building a product for years. Like, I don't want to consult until I'm 60, 70 years old when I retire. So I've been looking for a product to build. Maybe this is that product. And ultimately, it wasn't really ComCon that drove it forward. It was seeing companies and organizations like the BBC use Zoom to bring in remote participants. And especially when it came to the BBC is meant to be agnostic. And here it was essentially giving free advertising to a publicly traded company. So, but before I get into that, Broadcaster was very much a byproduct. Broadcaster.VC Limited, was very much a byproduct of EU rules. And before we talk about get into the whole Brexit scenario, this would have been an issue before Brexit anyway. But essentially, if you're selling to a consumer in the EU, there's a load of red tape, and you have to tax the right amount of money, depending on where you are, where that person receiving that service is. And so if you're selling to a consumer in France, you have to tax them the right amount for the taxes in France. And so I didn't want to bog down the consulting business with all of this. And so we formed Broadcaster.VC Limited. If it wasn't for all of this, then it would have been a product of Nimble Ape. But isn't this talk really meant to be about open source? And yes, it is. But I had to tell you about how we got to here. So yes, but at the same time, there's a ton of complexity to running a business. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're running open source tooling or anything. Actually spinning up a business and doing things the right way is actually very, very difficult and very time consuming. So let's talk about open source. While there are many, many, many parts of, well, not many, there's a couple of parts of Broadcaster that aren't open source at all, that are built on not open source parts at all. I can think of 3 big ones, but the core of it all is. And I want to do a shout out to Dave Horton here. He was really the inspiration for me wanting to put this talk in, because ultimately, we as companies that build on top of open source software don't say thank you enough. So all of those companies that are building products off of FreeSwitch or Dractio or Janus, we need to start saying, or any of these open source platforms or open source products or projects, we need to start saying thank you publicly, because we need to make sure that people actually understand that open source drives 99.99% of businesses across the world. And so Dave made me think about this, and I'll be putting the same list that I put together for this talk onto the Broadcaster website. So what open source do we use? So first of all, we use Janus Gateway from Meet Echo. We also use Node. We use a couple of clients for talking to Janus. And then we've got some open source UI and Docker and Kubernetes and Prometheus and Grafana, InfluxDB, Traefik, Harbor for storing Docker images, Ghost for our blog, Request Tracker for dealing with issues, Matrix for internal communications and alerts, React itself, Postgres, MariaDB, GStreamer, Telegraph, Ansible, libWebRTC because it's inside the browsers themselves, Yarn, and Uptime Kuma. I don't know if I'm saying that last one properly, plus all of their inherent dependencies. And so you can see there's a link there with the list that Jambones uses. And that's the list that prompted me to do this talk. So I encourage everyone who is building a business on top of open source software to acknowledge the fact that they are using open source software and do it publicly, and to do it in a nice format so that people can go, Broadcaster uses Janus. Maybe that's a good platform. Maybe that's a good project to go and use because Broadcaster is a good thing. Maybe. So I don't think I could have bootstrapped Broadcaster without open source software. I don't think it would have been possible. I mean, it's very easy for me to say that because I've worked with open source software all of my professional life. I came out of university and went into a job, the job that David was talking to you about. And ultimately, I was working on PHP. Then I was working on it with HTML and JavaScript, and I'm very much a web developer. And then I got into Node and everything else. So with MySQL databases, and then going into Redis and everything else that we did as web people. And so my point is, it's easy for me to say that I couldn't have built it without open source software, but that's because that's all I've ever really known. Because ultimately, we build stuff with open source and then we give back to open source, and I don't want to change that. So, but so back to the story at hand. We had a beta product last December, so we started actually building. So the timescale for this is ClueCon happened in June, I think July, and then I think we started building Broadcaster properly around September, October time, just trying to get little bits here and there. And then we launched a beta product at just before Christmas with a view of, come February time, we'll implement all of the things that people have asked for, and then we'll launch and we'll start making some money. But no, we didn't launch in February, and we didn't launch in March, and we didn't launch in April. And ultimately, it took us until the beginning of October, end of September, to feel ready to launch. And ultimately, why did it take 10 months to launch? Billing. And I mean, hopefully there's some sort of reaction in the room, because billing is my personal nightmare. And you can hear there we go. So imagine that's billing. And this is how I felt about billing. Yeah, I hate billing. And ultimately, I didn't actually write any of the code for it. An employee of mine called Marco did 99% of all of the hard work, and he did a fantastic job. So yeah, who knew charging people the right amount at the right time with the right amount of tax was difficult. I didn't think it was that difficult until we started doing it. So ultimately, it's not really building the product that takes the time. It's absolutely everything else. So yes, who knew that we were going to spend the better part of 9 months, maybe 8 months, 9 months, working on billing, basically. Yeah, absolute nightmare. And unfortunately, no amount of open source software can save you when it comes to billing, because it's a pain and you have to integrate into stuff. So without the paid for services, we'd actually not be where we are today. Like, we use Stripe, and Stripe has a new product to deal with tax, and they announced it just at the right period, just at the right time. We were starting to look at tax and charging the right amount and storing the right information. And then they launched their tax product, and I emailed them begging to get onto their beta, because it was going to potentially save us so much time. And so we use their invoicing, we use their subscription, we use their product, we use a lot of what Stripe has to offer. And there are other platforms that do similar things to Stripe. But still, even using Stripe, it took a long time to feel comfortable to be ready to launch. And we also use Firebase. We use Firestore from Firebase, and we use Firebase Auth, because it makes everything simple. I don't have to think about scaling a database. Google do it for me. But open source software did do something, and it meant that we could build Broadcaster without having to get external funding. Like, can you imagine having to pay, like, from the get-go to be able to access a database and to be able to do whatever, because you're restricted to licensing and everything else? Without open source, I would hazard a guess that 99% of businesses wouldn't survive, and we don't give enough thanks back. So building a demo is very, very easy, but building a product is actually really quite difficult. And this was a hard lesson that I had, even though I'd spent the past 8 years consulting. think it's about 8 years now, doing actual consulting, going into businesses, helping them build products and figuring out all the difficult things. Ultimately, I spent the last 8 years helping people build product, like building a demo, right? It might be a fancy demo and it might be a very polished demo, but ultimately I haven't actually had to go and build a business that has to deal with billing and things required by law. Very, very difficult. So I'm only 15 minutes in, but I was kind of hoping that we could have a discussion. What open source software does your business use? Have you said thanks publicly? Is there a reason you haven't said thanks publicly? I want to understand why people don't say thank you publicly. I did a blog post sometime last year saying thank you to open source, and it got a mixed reaction because some people see it as, oh, well, people will know what I'm running. That's a security risk. No, if people really want to know what you're running, they will know what you're running. I'm sorry, but that's a lame ass excuse. It's really difficult doing a talk when you can't see the audience. Anyway, hopefully after ComCon Virtual, we won't have to do that anymore because we'll all be able to see each other in person sometime soon. So yes, is there a reason people don't do it? Is there a reason why you haven't done it? Do you think that we should be saying thank you to open source as much as we are, like as little as we are now? And no, paying to go to ClueCon does not equal thank you to the FreeSwitch team if you use FreeSwitch. I'm sorry, because there are so many other benefits to going to ClueCon that it's not a thank you. You're not giving them some money. Like, it costs SignalWire to put money to put the conference on in the first place, and you're just helping them with those costs. So yes, back to David in the room, what are people's thoughts on this, both in the virtual space and in the room in Chicago?
Okay, Dan. Thank you for that.
David, I just want to say very quickly, I told you I wasn't going to go over.
You did remarkably well. Finished slightly early, Dan, which is almost unknown for you.
I know.
Almost unknown. So well done that. But by the way, how is it in England at the moment?
It is cold and miserable. We get patches of sunny, and that's it.
It's the English way, isn't it? A little bit of coldness and miserableness. Excellent. Yeah. Okay, so now, Boat. I'm noticing we don't have mics for the questions at the moment. So if anybody has questions for Dan, if you want to raise your hand.
Yeah, maybe David can relay them for me.
Relay it through me. We'll make sure that it goes into the conference. What questions have people got for Dan? Not seeing any questions come up here. Devon's not seeing any online at the moment. Okay. Dan, I do have a question. You said that sure. Dave Horton inspired you to go ahead and do that. How much Dractio is used inside your system there?
So within Broadcaster, Dractio isn't used at all. However, Dractio is a heavy portion of what we do consulting on, because especially over the past 18 to 24 months, a lot before, but especially a lot during the pandemic, people wanted to WebRTC enable their PBX, for example, or WebRTC enable their SIP system, right? And so ultimately, Dractio is a very good place to start with that, because we can match it with RTP engine, and I can write actual like node code and not config files for Camellia or whatever, and it gives me a lot of flexibility. So yes, Dractio is not used a lot at all within Broadcaster, but it is used heavily within my consulting. So while David's off the screen,
I'm coming back.
Okay, I've got a question from Dave Haran. What ways can we thank the contributors to OSS we use to encourage them to continue building, supporting the product? That's an interesting question. So what ways can we thank the contributors to open source software we use to encourage them to continue building, supporting the product? As someone that does a bit of open source stuff and then contributing back, I love it when people put in pull requests. I love it when people fix code, and I love it when people put in good bug reports that actually tell me how to fix something instead of just this doesn't work. So number one, put in pull requests, give back. Put in pull requests, put in issues, put in decent issues, and then there's financial, right? So there are many ways to give back money. So, for example, Dractio has a GitHub sponsors account, and so you can subscribe and give Dave / the Dractio project money, and then ultimately he puts that money back into the project with his time.
Okay, Dan, just on this whole issue of giving back to open source projects, it's a subject that comes up very often. And actually, if you go to the Free Switch YouTube channel, there is a ClueCon weekly, and I've forgotten how old it is, but we do talk about it. And I had a conversation with a gentleman in Germany, and he was saying even asking a question on a forum is a way of giving back, because other people might have that same question when they're searching on Google. It's going to pop up. And so I fully endorse what Dan says, that a financial contribution is no bad contribution at all. The obvious things like code, bug marshalling, documentation is another big one. Documentation is, in fact, a very, very important part of an open source project. And generally speaking, the people that wrote all the code don't like doing the documentation. And so that's another great thing you can do to give back to your favorite open source project.
Ultimately, David, they're not the right people to do the documentation most of the time, because they're in the thick of it, and they don't think that something is difficult, right? They go, everyone knows that because that's what they do day in, day out. It's when people come to a project fresh and go, how do I get started with this? All of this documentation doesn't make any sense to me. It's those people that we want to catch and kind of help guide through, and then help make the documentation easier, so that the next person that comes in fresh as a web developer who has never done real-time media before can actually come in and go, I get this. And that's a really vital part of what open source projects across the whole spectrum, not just real-time communications. That's something that we all struggle with.
Yeah, you make an interesting point, and actually, Dan, that you can expand that even further and say about the training for a given project as well, because the training, of course, is done for new people, and there should be a relationship between the training, the documentation, and ultimately, the code or the operation itself. Now, Dan, while we've been talking, Moshe has stepped up to the podium. I wonder if the mic is on there for Moshe to ask a question. Is there a button on the mic?
It's working.
Okay, Moshe, go ahead with your question for Dan.
First, a commercial announcement. I did edit part of the Free Switch website to improve the document, or I hope it was an improvement of the documentation. And if you have a particular itch you want to scratch, it is possible to become an editor of the Free Switch documentation. Okay?
Great, good stuff.
Okay, great. Okay. My question actually is a very straightforward one. When there is an open source project, there is a license. When there's a license, could you tell me give me an estimate of how many different kinds of licenses there are that you had to comply with, and whether it actually ever caused you any issues? Thank you.
No, it didn't cause me any problems, but maybe that's just because I've been building stuff with open source software for so long that I'm able to kind of, I already look at stuff, and I already know about stuff because I consult. And therefore, pretty much everything, almost everything, everything that we used for Broadcaster, I already knew. I already knew like some sort of, I already had some sort of relationship or whatever, mostly. But within Broadcaster, there's like 4 different main licenses that are used. So when I publish the list, it will have a list of licenses next to all of them, and that's what Dave Horton's website does, and I think that's what Fred's does as well. That I linked to in the slide, because ultimately, yes, open source is very much defined by what is the license, right? So we should be very public about what kind of licenses are around everything.
Great, thank you, Dan. And you touched on an interesting point, the fact that you knew some of the people from the projects. This is one of the beauties of open source software, is you can go and actually ask questions of the people that run the project. I mean, coming to ClueCon, you get to hang out with Tony, Brian, Mike Jerris, Enzo. Can you imagine if you were using some kind of Microsoft project and you wanted to talk to the people? It'd be a very, very different kettle of fish, a different thing to do. And so that is one of the amazing things about open source. Not only is that an amazing thing, but the t-shirts are an amazing thing about ClueCon, aren't they? I understand that this particular t-shirt, and the reason I've switched gears and talking about the t-shirt for a minute, is Dan mentioned what a good t-shirt it was. And Dan, it is. I know you can't do it from there, but if you were to feel the quality, it is a beautiful feel to the t-shirts.
But does it compare to a first-gen ComCon t-shirt, David?
Well, having worn both, Dan, and without bias, I'm going to say yes. They're both beautiful things. They both feel very good on the skin. Now, t-shirts are usually designed by Abby, but I have it on good authority that this year's ClueCon t-shirt, with it being a little bit of a retro, being brought up-to-date design, was actually a job of both Abby and Jill and Abby both work together. So can we have a quick, before we come to giving a round of applause to Dan, can we have a quick round of applause for the beautiful ClueCon t-shirts? And if you didn't get one just yet, you can see there's plenty out there on the table. So Dan, you've brought us into a landing.
If there's any left, I will gladly have one.
I'll tell you what, Dan, since we're buddies, I will try and get an extra one in the suitcase alongside all those towels and gowns and things. I can hardly shut it, actually. Well, I'll try and get one in the case and bring it back to England for you, Dan.
Thank you very much, David.
You can tell me your size offline. I won't embarrass you. Okay, you brought it into a landing. Bang on time, Dan. So let's give a big ClueCon round of applause to Dan Jenkins in England.
Thank you, everyone.